I hope that by now you have followed the instructions in the Cordova's iOS platform guide to install Xcode and the iOS emulator onto your platform so that now your Mac is ready to do iOS development from your Ionic application. So to proceed forward, let's first configure a few things and then build and deploy your Ionic application to an iOS emulator. I don't happen to have an iOS device or the iOS developer's license, so I am unable to demonstrate to you the deployment to an iOS device. Instead, since I am running this on a Mac, I am able to demonstrate to you how to deploy your application to an iOS emulator. So let's follow along the instructions. Before you proceed forward, there is one change that you need to make. You need to make this change because when you are running the app in an emulator, the emulator is a separate virtual machine, and so it won't be able to understand localhost to mean your computer. When you mention localhost and you run that in an emulator, it interprets localhost as the emulator itself. But that's not where our server is running. Our server is running on our computer. So in order to configure your application to be able to properly access the server, you need to change the localhost in your services.js file. So open your services.js file, and for this constant, the base URL, change this value localhost to the IP address of your computer. So find out the IP address of your computer and then go ahead and make a change to that localhost to the equivalent IP address of your computer. So after you make the change, save the changes, and then we'll proceed to the next step. Now, I am going to make the change to that localhost to the IP address of my computer. Obviously, I don't want you to know the IP address of my computer, so I'm not going to show that step to you. But remember that I have actually done the substitution of localhost by the IP address of my computer. Now, open your terminal. Now, make sure that your JSON server is running so that it is able to serve up the resources when it is accessed by your app. Then, in your terminal, go to the confusion folder where your application is stored. And then the first thing that we need to ensure is that you need to ensure that iOS sim has been installed. If not, at the command prompt, type npm install -g iOS sim. You must have done this as part of your iOS installation instructions for Cordova. If you had not done that, remember to do this. I have already done that as part of my installation of Xcode and the Cordova support, so I'm not going to do that in this exercise. Instead, we'll go to the next step. Next, to your application, add the iOS platform. So to do that, we at the command prompt type Ionic platform add iOS and let that complete the installation of the platform. Now, I had already added the iOS platform earlier, so that's why it is informing me that the platform iOS is already added. Obviously, I had to test and make sure that it works correctly, so I have already installed that. If you execute this command, then it'll print out a bunch of things on your terminal before successfully configuring your iOS platform for your Confusion app. The next step would be to build the iOS app for your platform. To do that, at the command prompt, type Ionic build iOS and let the build process complete. Once your build process is complete, then at the command prompt, type Ionic emulate iOS. This will open an iOS emulator and deploy your application to that emulator and start running that application. So let's go ahead and start this command. It will take a while for the iOS emulator to come up on the screen. So once that comes up on the screen, then you will be able to see the application running in the emulator. So in this case, because my screen is small, so it is unable to fit the entire iOS emulator. Let me see if I can resize the emulator. Okay, to be able to fit most of the emulator screen onto my computer screen, I resized that emulator window to 50%. So you can see the Confusion app deployed to the emulator here, and it's working as expected. So you can see the home page here. We should be able to go to the menu and see the menu, and then you should be able to add items to your favorites, and then when you switch the favorites, they should show up there, and then you should be able to delete items from your favorites and go back to the menu. This completes the exercise. In this exercise, we have learned how to be able to configure for the iOS platform, build your app for the iOS platform, and then deploy it to the iOS emulator.